The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Danny Glass, and he is a co-founder over at Celaware Technologies. And we're going to dive into a little bit about Danny's background and how he came to become a co-founder of Celaware Technologies and what they're focused on, talking about Chat WMS, which is pretty interesting. I got to see a little demo of it back at Manifest earlier this year, and pretty exciting stuff on how they're kind of taking on AI and looking at WMS and analytics in a little bit of a different way within the warehouse, which we'll talk about today. So, Danny, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Definitely. Happy to get you on. Happy to talk about this and talk about what you're doing and where it kind of came from. But before we kind of dive into all the details here, why don't you give us a little overview of kind of your background and what really led up to the founding of this company that you have now called Celaware Technologies?
Sure, absolutely. I guess, before I get into that, I wanted to say very, very honored to be on your podcast. I'm a big fan of it. I think it's an excellent resource for both newbies and those who are experienced. I think the depth of knowledge between you and the guests that you bring on is, like I said, an excellent resource. I'm happy that I get to contribute to it. So once again, thank you for putting this on and having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And definitely, happy that we can deliver value in some way, and happy to get you on to share what you're up to with our audience as well.
Absolutely. So Celaware Technologies, I guess I kind of ought to start with a little bit of my background. My first job out of college was an operations supervisor at DHL Supply Chain, a pretty prominent third-party logistics company. Although at the time, I guess we were called XL, spelled EXEL.
Yeah,
and
I
think
remember
DHL,
those days. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. And I think DHL had already acquired XL, but we just hadn't done the rebranding just yet. And I'll admit I was happy when the rebranding eventually happened, because I got a little bit tired of explaining that, no, I'm not associated with Microsoft XL. I'm associated with a third-party logistics company, which would then, to my friends who knew nothing about logistics, I had to explain what a 3PL was. And at that point, I'm still very much learning. So it was a good thing all around. So, but starting in operations really influenced a lot of how I view problems and solutions in this space. And I look back at that experience very fondly, starting as an operations supervisor. But it wasn't before long that I started to enjoy tackling the systems related problems and using those technical skills. And so, like I said, before long, I took another job as a systems analyst at another site in the region. And that's where I met my eventual business partner, Luke Hoffman. And we had a lot of commonalities, a lot of similar experiences that kind of led us to each other. And it felt like we always had ideas, and we were always kind of scheming on how we could make our operation better. Well, time went by and we ended up landing ourselves in different roles at different companies. And, COVID hit. And in 2020, we decided that we wanted to start something together with, some of our newfound experiences. And we decided that we wanted to found Celaware Technologies with the primary aim of applying artificial intelligence in the supply chain, and specifically in the warehouse, in a practical way. And we had some very big ideas. That was a time when there was a lot of hype building for artificial intelligence. And so we took it upon ourselves to really build a strong set of fundamentals and foundation in that space, so we could get a better understanding for what kind of solutions would actually apply. I think that's very important when looking at AI, is looking at it realistically, as what is it going to help? What is it? And, more importantly, what is it not? We had some very ambitious ideas. And to be honest with you, that was back in 2020. And we didn't make a whole lot of headway with them. It wasn't until 2023 that we saw, or I guess the end of 2022, early 2023, that we saw ChatGPT.
Right.
And I think at that point in time, everybody thought to themselves, what can you do with this? And that got us very excited because that new kind of technology was not before seen. Ultimately, that's kind of what began the process of Chat WMS.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I love the journey there. And I mentioned, I remember the Excel days because I think the company I was working for, we were transitioning to DHL like right when that was kind of happening, I think, or had recently happened. And that's the only reason I know about it or am aware, but I do remember that. And, I think it's very interesting too, like, to find this use case for, I guess, AI in a sense. So, Chat GPT certainly kind of exploded, it seems like, very rapidly, not just from an industry or business perspective, but just in an overall, I guess, culture perspective, right? I mean, everybody was starting to use Chat GPT, and what is Chat GPT, and all these questions, early last year in 2023, as you mentioned. And now you're certainly a play on Chat GPT, Chat WMS, right? Love the name. Yeah, makes total sense. But tell us why, kind of, because you said you were doing some different type of ideas you had in there of how you could use AI in different applications, but this was kind of the one that really kind of, I guess, hit home and, now has been the idea that you've been pushing forward. So tell us kind of why Chat WMS? Why did you land on this one, and why is this kind of what you're going forward with?
Sure. Yeah. I'd say there's kind of two main reasons there. Kind of like I mentioned, when everybody saw ChatGPT, immediately everybody thought, oh my gosh, what can I do with technology that can dynamically understand language? And then from there, it can follow instructions and it can understand sentiment and intentionality. And ultimately, it can even, in isolated situations, write code very well. So the use cases are seemingly endless to some extent. And I was actually, listening to another episode that you released recently with somebody from PepsiCo Labs. I believe her name was Anna, and she was talking about how their innovation approach is kind of the opposite of tech forward. Tech forward being, oh, here's this shiny new object. What can I throw at this? What can I use it for? The opposite of that being a far more practical and pragmatic approach of, I have this problem in my space, in my network, whatever it might be. What can I do to help alleviate or solve this problem? What tech is going to be relevant to doing that? And I would say that that's certainly probably a better way to go about it, the pragmatic, the practical way. But I think that some things intrinsically are tech forward, right? I'll use ChatGPT as an example, but I guess I'll go back, maybe not necessarily the best example, but the atomic bomb, I think, is a good example of something that's tech forward. I think everybody has seen the Oppenheimer movie, or at least knows a little bit about that stage of development. Well, and I'm not an expert in it by any means, but once it was discovered, once the neutron was discovered and it was proven that you could split atoms, people before that weren't thinking, well, we need bigger bombs. People saw that and thought, what can you do with this? And that's when the race for the atomic bomb kind of began. So I think with ChatGPT, part of the initial kind of guidation of us to act came from seeing this new technology and then thinking, okay, what are all the things we could do with it based off our experiences? So to kind of come back to the experience that really is the inspiration for it, at least from my perspective, comes from my operations experience back in the XL DHL supply chain days. Well, I was at that point still very new and trying to understand my place in the warehouse and how I could contribute. And we had an issue with our system one day where we had a storage configuration problem. If I recall, we were like 30% racking and then 70% bulk floor storage. We had product that stacked relatively well, so we could leverage that. And we had a scenario where multiple footprints of the same item, multiple configurations of it, were getting mixed in the same bulk storage locations, and that was a no-no for a lot of reasons. So it was a relatively, if I recall, relatively simple fix, a configuration change in the WMS to stop that from happening going forward. But we needed a way to determine what the damage was, right? Like, okay, how many locations has this applied to already, have been affected? And there wasn't really a good way for us to get that information, right? The WMS didn't have just a pre-built report to show us all the locations that had multiple footprints in them for the same item. There wasn't a screen that was conducive to that. So we're all kind of deliberating. And at this point, I'm not very knowledgeable, not very experienced. I was surrounded by a lot of very experienced people. And so they're all talking about how we can solve this problem. We could do an open find on inventory display and export that to Excel, and we could aggregate it from there, and so on and so forth. But we were a 3PL, so we had a customer working with us at the site, and he walks away, comes back after a minute, and puts a report on everybody's on the desk that we were at, and sure enough, it was a list of all the locations that had multiple footprints. And to everybody else, oh, thanks, we'll get right on this, business as usual. But to me, trying to find my place in this operation, that was a huge light bulb moment. What did you do? How did you do that? That was amazing. I found out later that he used SQL to do that, and he just wrote a query. SQL, for those in the audience that aren't familiar, stands for Structured Query Language. And it's the programming language that allows you to interact with database systems. And generally speaking, most software, especially enterprise software, is going to store its data in a database system. So knowing SQL is going to allow you to interact with your database systems. And there's so much data typically that's stored. You can get a lot of insights if you know what you're doing. And so I took it upon myself to learn what he did and learn those skills, for a number of reasons. Part of it wanting a competitive advantage, some of it wanting to contribute to my operation, so on and so forth. I kind of talked about it in my intro that I got into the system side. Well, that was kind of the story of how I got into it. And so that experience of seeing that power and learning those technical skills, it taught me that sometimes the best way to solve problems, data problems, is to go to interact with your data directly in a dynamic way. If you want to make truly good data-driven decisions, then you want to have the tools and the skills to interact with your data at that level and not have to use some opinionated interface that won't necessarily check all the boxes for you when you really need it. And so with that technology coming out, ChatGPT type technology, the ability to understand language, and that kind of experience, we felt that we could deliver that experience to the people who don't necessarily have those skills. The current state of large language models is they're generally very good at writing SQL, for instance, and we figured that would be a very good use case for this kind of language understanding technology. Instead of having to go through an interface, you can interact with your data directly, and you can answer a lot more questions. And in my experience, when you answer questions, that generates more questions, which generates more answers, which generates more questions. And before you know it, you've gone down this rabbit hole and you understand a lot more about your operation, about the problem at hand, whatever it might be. So to kind of summarize that, how I would describe Chat WMS is it is a natural language interface to your warehouse management system, be the data, be the documentation. Using the latest in large language model capabilities and technology, you can effectively have a conversation with your warehouse management system in the way that is most comfortable to you, and derive those insights from it. Which, in my experience in operations, there's a lot of value in that, because I know how much smarter I got with respect to my operation once I could interact with the data at that level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it's kind of an unlocking of the mind in a sense when you start to, like you said, get to that level and interact with that data. But to your point there, as the operations manager or supervisor or something, that data, I guess, acumen and knowledge on how to interact with that data isn't necessarily typically in that background, or even something maybe that's of interest, in that type of role, either to that extent of, going out and just writing a query in SQL like that person did that you saw. So, I mean, being able to kind of bring that down to a level where it's easy to kind of get the data that you're looking for outside of, pre-canned reports and things like that for different scenarios. And like you said, dig in deeper and keep going further down and drill further down and start to understand really what's happening from an analytics and data perspective within the operation is such a great, I think, value add and things to do with that. I mean, I've said this on the podcast a couple times, but I've certainly, I'm a data guy. I always embraced data when I was an operations manager, and, but I certainly had, direct reports or, colleagues as well that, they just outright would say like, oh, like I hate Excel, right? Or like I hate, I hate working with data. Like I just want to, go with what I feel, right? But at the same time, like, there's problems with that. Sometimes that works, sure, yeah, but at the same time, you start to make these more kind of data-driven decisions or take data-driven actions, then you're going to get better results, and you're going to optimize better for the long term too, as well as the short term. So it's great that you're making it kind of more accessible around this chat WMS solution to be able to pull what you want. So I'm curious. I mean, you're certainly making it easier and more digestible to work with the data. But as we look at kind of, the idea of AI as a whole, I mean, what are some of the reactions around this? Maybe some hesitations. Like, what are challenges when you're trying to start to begin to adopt some of this technology within the operation?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, to kind of, I guess when we talk about this technology, I'll kind of break it up into two categories. Our solution is built upon the latest in large language models, which I guess I would classify more on the generative AI side. And then there's your kind of, not old fashioned, but it's amazing how quickly things are changing and innovating. And so then there's the old fashioned, just kind of AI solution that's kind of just an analytical solution to help predict something, right? So I think that in general, with respect to AI, it feels like there's an appetite there. Absolutely. Maybe you would agree or disagree with this. I think historically, supply chain and warehousing have been relatively slow to innovate and take on innovative solutions. Maybe COVID has changed that for good because the spotlight was shined on the supply chain. But in my experience, that's kind of the case. The last thing I see in an organization that they start to optimize is their supply chain processes, typically. And so, like I said, I think, judging from all the trade shows and conferences I go to, it seems like it's all that's talked about. You mentioned that we both went to Manifest together. I was at Blue Yonder Icon recently. I went to Modex this year as well. And there will be more later this year. It seems like it gets talked about more and more. It seems like everybody's very excited about it. But on the other hand, I'll admit, I don't really see it too much implemented on the ground. Maybe it's implemented in a way that is, hidden or obfuscated to some extent, but I'm not really seeing it too much on the ground. So maybe, what's that disconnect there? I think people see this shiny object and think it's going to solve all their problems. I think that's one of maybe the big problems is the incorrect assumptions about what AI is going to do for your organization as a whole, whether it's generative AI or some other mechanism of it. But, what is that disconnect? Maybe, I guess I'll kind of compare it, and I think you'll have experience in this area. I've seen, because I also have a good amount of experience consulting, doing just WMS consulting. And I've had a couple of customers that would implement a WMS for the first time ever. And, from a paper-based system or no system at all, system, a loose term here. And obviously there's a lot of great benefits you're going to get out of going from nothing to a WMS, but you're also going to realize that you've opened a Pandora's box of all new problems that you've never had before. You're going to realize that you don't have SOPs. You're going to realize that you don't have work instructions. You're going to realize that all the wisdom of your operation is contained in tribal knowledge, right? So all of these things are going to stack up all at once, and it's a very daunting process for somebody who doesn't have a WMS to implement one. I guess I'll liken that to AI. If you don't have good, solid data practices and don't have good, complete data and high quality data, that's one of the things that people tend to say is garbage in, garbage out, right? If you don't have solid data, then you might not get much out of it. If you don't have solid procedures and documentation and things of that nature, then regardless of what the shiny new object looks like or delivered for somebody else, it might not necessarily work very well for your operation. So maybe there's a little barrier to entry there. Once people actually start to look at the effort that it's going to take to implement some of these nice AI solutions, maybe that's when it kind of fizzles out. I'm not sure. What would your impression of that be? Because you go to a lot of trade shows and you interview a ton of people. I'd be curious to get your impression.
Yeah. I think, I agree that, there's certainly a lot of hype around AI, you could say. And, I think I've often joked on the podcast before that, you're seeing a lot of companies where, all of a sudden now they're .ai companies, and, especially at the trade shows and things like that. And I think that, there's been certainly a push because there's so much talk about it where companies are trying to figure out how do they bring AI into their solution, because I think people are interested in learning about that. But I think, like you said, I think the actual adoption rate is pretty low, which is, very similar to like what we've seen with robotics and automation as well, even though, you walk into like a Modex and you're surrounded by it everywhere. Yep. Like the actual adoption and penetration into the market is still fairly low. Like there's still a lot of room to go for people to really get that on board. And I think it's the same with AI. And I think, to your point, I totally agree with you that our industry is traditionally slow to, adopt new technologies, because a lot of times, and I think there's a stigma around the idea of implementation and, updating and things like that, because it leads to potential disruption of operations. And, it's very hard for a lot of businesses to just stop operations to put something new in place, even though maybe, long term it would be beneficial, but it's hard to get past that idea of any type of disruption. So I think it is still fairly early to see, widespread adoption of these types of solutions. But I think that there are a lot of definite applications where I think people are finding them useful. And I think, as they're getting kind of built into solutions that maybe are already in place and, pushed out as new features and things like that, it becomes easier to do that type of thing. But yeah, I think the use case that you guys are going after, I think is really, really smart to be able to enable, that, supervisor, manager to have more access to data they need, like kind of at their fingertips. Literally in a sense, right? And be able to kind of extract that information and, make those decisions in a better way, and start to see how we can leverage that AI power to be able to do that. So that's kind of my take, I would say, and what I see out there and from my conversations. But, I'm interested to hear kind of too from your perspective. As you're getting this out there in the market and, people are starting to use it and see how they can utilize it. How does it kind of, if you take an operations manager, for example, how does it change the way that they're kind of either like viewing or just interacting with the WMS overall?
Yeah. So before I answer that really quick, you brought up robotics, and I thought that was a great example. I think if you ask the industry to close their eyes and envision what the modern warehouse looks like in 50 years, they're probably robotics are probably going to come to their mind. They might think of a dark warehouse, completely automated, whatever that looks like, humanoid robots, or, more traditional robots that kind of perform one purpose. Who knows what that will look like. But robotics solutions generally there's a big barrier to entry to implement those, right? Like to your point, there's potentially a lot of disruption. There's a good initial investment, potentially significant initial investment to do it. And you're probably going to get a really big benefit out of it, but not every company necessarily wants to take that risk. And so with Cellaware, in addition to practicality, we've also wanted to gear our solutions to be minimally invasive, something that kind of what we would hope would break the mold a little bit of software solutions. Historically, if you want to implement a WMS or an LMS or a robotic solution or what have you, it's going to be a long lead time, big implementation process. You mentioned the stigma of implementation. So Chat AMS is an excellent example of, we thought long and hard, how can we make this as close to risk-free as possible and as minimally invasive as possible? And that's kind of the direction that we've taken. So to answer your question in regards to how the interfacing with your system is going to change for your frontline leaders, your operations managers, supervisors, GMs, directors, and above, theoretically could derive value from things like this. Yeah, I think that's a really good question that I I would say I don't necessarily have the perfect answer to,
Mm.
but my gut tells me significantly that this could end up being one of the new interface options for any system, not just supply chain systems, that very, very flexible, very dynamic, allows you to communicate with it in whatever way you feel comfortable. In the future, we'll be able to do actions. That's something that ChatWMS currently does not support. ChatWMS is read only. Part of that comes from our experience of not wanting some entity having access to your production data, right? And so ChatWMS is read only at this point, but in the future, we could see the technology getting better and allowing you to perform actions that are going to be far more efficient and conducive to the actual process that you're following. You could do a lot of things at once, for instance. So, I mean, I think the interface alone brings up a lot of really interesting opportunities. But as far as with ChatAMS in your pocket, how does that change your workflow? I mean, how much smarter do you think an operation would be if all of the supervisors and the managers had expert level analytic or technical SQL skills, right? Or had a dedicated analyst tied to their hip 24/7 to answer any question that they could have, right? If you and I go to trivia and I have my cell phone and you don't, I should, unless it's like a music round, although they have, Shazam for stuff like that now, I should beat you, right? I mean, my phone makes me a lot smarter than not having it, right? And so I think a similar phenomenon can be had here. You now will have unprecedented access to your data that you never had before, that was reserved only for those who had the necessary technical expertise. Like I said, my personal experience leads me to believe how useful it would be, because I know how much I learned and how much I benefited from having those skills and running my operation. And so to kind of answer that question, I think significantly it will benefit the workflow. And I think this kind of technology will have large impacts on interfaces as a whole. You're going to start to see more and more of these co-pilots and chatbots come out. There's just no doubt in my mind. Not only is it the hot new fad, but it has long lasting positive ramifications on software interfacing. So.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I love how you said, if you had a data analyst like tied to your hip like 24/7, right, basically. And I think a lot of times from an operations perspective, especially from a management supervisor perspective, you're on the floor and you're thinking about something and you want to just know like right then, like what is the answer to this question before you get sidetracked by somebody else's question or something out there, and you forget to take a note and then you think about it later, and then if you're waiting for an analyst to kind of give you that information, then it's it's like kind of lost in a sense, or maybe it's too late, and you can take like action right away. Like I think it just makes you that much better to be able to improve your operation and just keep your operation flowing in a better way. So very interesting. I mean, what you've built here, and I guess we should clarify too. I don't think we mentioned this, but the chat WMS, is this only for your own WMS that you've developed, or can this get overlaid on any WMS?
Oh, very good question. Definitely a necessary point to clarify. It is WMS agnostic. It can work with any WMS in existence, so long as that, and currently this is the case, so long as that WMS stores its data in what's called a relational database management system, which is going to be probably 100% of any existing WMS. All of its transactional data is going to be stored in a relational database management system. And so effectively, it is completely WMS agnostic. It works with anything.
And that's great. I mean, I think that's a fantastic tool, and one that, easily, we talked about the adoption of AI is certainly an easy way to bring something in and just put it over top of what you have already in place without a huge lift, as you mentioned previously. So it's very interesting to learn from you here, Danny, and learn more about the chat WMS and what you guys have been working on with Cellular Technologies. But as we look to the future of Cellular Technologies, what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. So we're very excited to announce that we have a pilot coming up for ChatAMS for a prominent third-party logistics company.
Nice.
I don't want to give too many details regarding that, just because we're very much still in discussions about it. But that's very exciting. Getting an opportunity to really show what we at Cellaware believe, which is how much this will positively affect warehouse operations. So that'll be very exciting to be able to do that pilot and see the effects and so on. In addition to that, we have some exciting potential collaborative partnerships with some other companies in the industry, combining our expertise and knowledge of generative AI, integrating with supply chain and warehousing systems, along with a domain-specific product that our partners have. Once again, I don't want to discuss too much in terms of specifics, but stay on the lookout for that as well. That not only do we have chat WMS pilots in the works, but we also have some additional innovative collaborations in the works as well with some partners in the industry. And we'll be continuing to go to some of the shows and continuing to get a feel for the landscape of our space, what new technology exists out there, ways that we can improve our offerings. And it's always exciting to see what the rest of the industry is doing and learn from that. So we're excited for the rest of the year. We think we have a lot of really exciting things coming up, and we're going to continue learning and growing. And
Definitely exciting stuff there, and definitely very interested to see how you guys continue to evolve and the different use cases that Chat WMS finds itself in the industry as those partnerships develop and those customers develop too as well. So it's been great to have you on the show here, Danny, and learn all about this. What's the best way to get in touch with you or learn more about Cellaware Technologies?
Sure. So we have a website, cellaware.com. For the most part, and on our website, we have all sorts of resources about Chat WMS. We recently just started a newsletter that I believe we're releasing a new version of every month. And I believe we've released that first version as well. I have to validate that. So, feel free to look at that. That'll communicate all things Cellaware Technologies and about Luke and I, the co-founders, things that we're working on, things that we've done, and where we're going. We're generally only active from a social media perspective on LinkedIn. And so you can search Cellaware Technologies on LinkedIn, and that should be sufficient for finding us.
All right, great stuff. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it. So, Danny, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.